Hello, everyone, and welcome to IOHR TV. I'm Louise Pine-Jones, and I'm Head of Research at IOHR. The role of women in the so-called Islamic State has been perceived in a number of ways in the media, by the public, and in policy circles. But how have these perceptions been developed and gendered, and how far do they counter or play into the hands of the extremist narrative? Today, I'm interviewing Sara Shaban, Assistant Professor of Journalism at Seattle Pacific. Sara's work focuses on the intersections between media, women's social movements, and geopolitics in the Middle East. Today, Sara is going to share some of her research findings with us. Sara, thank you for being with us today. You have also previously worked as a journalist, so you have had first-hand experience in reporting on sensitive stories. What are your thoughts on how the media has covered the stories of women and young women that have joined Islamist and militant groups in Syria and Iraq?
Well, it depends, right? Not all media outlets are created equal. For instance, The Guardian in the UK and The Atlantic in the US have allowed more space to go into more depth with certain stories. And that depth helps facilitate more nuance. I also think that having journalists of color covering these stories also allows for a more insightful perspective. I can definitely see a difference in the coverage. For instance, in the Shamima Begum case, I have a British Pakistani journalist friend who wrote a piece for The Guardian specifically offering an outlook that questioned how British you have to be in order to be granted the right to face justice on the land that you were born in. So I think taking that into account on who the journalist is and what the outlet is makes a big difference. Now, in terms of just your run-of-the-mill news outlets, I think that it's been very short-sighted, the coverage for sure. I think it's been racialized. I think it's been gendered, especially when talking about women. They're often framed as victims. If not victims, then completely mad. There's no middle ground there. There's no spectrum. It's either you were duped into it, or you have to be crazy to have done it anyway. Problematic coverage of women who joined ISIS is also reflective of Western news values that prioritize novelty, danger, essentially sensationalism.
You wrote a paper analysing the media coverage of the three Bethnal Green girls that left the UK in 2015 to go to Syria. One of them was Shamima Begum. What are your main findings?
Ultimately, what I found and expected to some extent was that the teenage girls were victimized from the very beginning. In the way the journalists would tell the story, the narrative that they perpetuated didn't make it seem like the girls had any choice in the matter, like they were completely just tricked into it, which doesn't really give them credit for any critical thinking that they may have had, or even just as being a young person thinking about wanting to join something, join a community, join something bigger than themselves, which, more recent research has shown that has a lot to do with why some of the young women went. The coverage also consistently referenced them as children, which I found really problematic, especially because it depends on what the cause is, right? So Malala, we know Malala, she was about the same age when she, maybe a little bit younger, when she came out and was speaking out against her own regime, right? And we gave her credit for that. We granted her agency for that. But because we have these girls who are around the same age who aren't promoting something that aligns with our own Western ideology, clearly they must have not had a choice in the matter.
How has the media coverage of young female teenagers and women that joined these groups differ from the coverage that men have had?
Drastically. And it's not new either. This has been going on forever. Like even when we talk about the Chechenian women, or even Lila from Palestine, right? Men are seen as a threat, and the women are either they're victimized, right? But they have also been sexualized in a lot of ways. And we've even seen that in this coverage of the women recruited to ISIS. We're always talking about them in a way of them being sexualized, of them being treated as sex slaves, as them being treated as baby machines. Men aren't seen that way. It's a very single lens for them. They're a threat, they're an enemy, they're going out there to fight against us. And I think that one of the reasons for that is because the Western perspective on Muslim women, brown women, is that they're docile, that they're subservient. So it makes sense to frame them as victims, whereas brown men or people who align with brown men ideology are seen as just a threat, that just simply a threat, no nuance there at all.
Why is the term jihadi bride so widespread, and why do you think media should not use such language?
Jihadi brides gets clicks. It sells papers, especially during this era or post era of the war on terror. It's a misogynistic word. It misconstrues the meaning of jihad, right, for most Muslims. By calling them jihadi brides, we're assuming that they're just there to marry fighters, that they're just there to procreate, and it completely takes out the idea that they could be leaders, that they could actually be on the front lines fighting as well. It also plays into ISIS strategy, because that's another way that ISIS can appeal to marginalized groups.
Do you think that the image that most news consumers have of women corresponds to the portrait that the media has made?
Absolutely. Journalists interpret world events for their audience. That's their job. And if you trained as a journalist at all, that's what you're taught. You set the agenda. And so, however the journalist is presenting that, if that's all the information I'm going to get, obviously that's how I'm going to interpret the situation, how I'm going to interpret the person. And furthermore, it's going to influence the way that I see people who look like them. It's also become a huge problem, especially in the climate that we're living in today.
How dangerous do you think it is when the media simplifies issues such as the process of radicalization, especially with young teenagers, where there are a lot of environmental factors to analyze as well?
Very. It lacks accountability. We need to address homegrown terrorism, which is something that we as Western countries have really had a hard time with. And what we as a nation, we also have to address what we as a nation state have done to help cultivate the vulnerability that Western teenagers have adapted to ISIS radicalization. What kind of environment have we created that teenage girls would feel that they would have more opportunities by joining ISIS than by staying in London? We have to question the leadership too, because when I looked at the coverage in my study, the leadership within the UK consistently blamed social media. They never did any kind of self-reflection about how they could have played into this.
Aside from the ethics of journalism, what do you think are the benefits of investing in training for journalists to report on such stories, both for tackling the issue of radicalization and for society itself?
I think that it would help prevent narratives of Islamophobia and xenophobia. That's besides preventing radicalization, that's the second thing that comes to mind immediately. Again, the way that we read about these men and women who have gone to join ISIS and are trying to come back, whatever ideas we have about Islam or we have about jihad are based off of what journalists have told us. If journalists actually looked at academic studies and see why women have been motivated to join ISIS, why they have been motivated to come back and implement that into their own work, I think we would have a lot more nuanced and revealing news coverage.
Thank you, Sara, for being with us today. Thank you for watching IOHR TV. Goodbye.